Elias had arrived at the academy with the same wide-eyed optimism as every other recruit, his heart full of dreams about honor, duty, and heroism, and his head crammed with the ideals he had grown up reading in training manuals and hearing in propaganda broadcasts. Yet it took only a few days for reality to grind those expectations into dust. For the academy was not a place that coddled idealists, it was a crucible that burned away illusions and left only hardened steel in those strong enough to survive. The rest were left broken, discarded, or forgotten. Elias found himself somewhere in between, too stubborn to quit but too unremarkable to be noticed. His uniform was always pressed to perfection, his boots polished until they gleamed, but no matter how presentable he looked, the instructors barely registered his presence. He was the kind of cadet who could sit in the front row of a briefing and still be overlooked. When questions were asked every morning before dawn, the recruits were marched out onto the training grounds, where the air bit with cold and the dirt crunched under their boots. The older cadets carried themselves with a weight that spoke of hard lessons learned in the field, while the newer ones, like Elias, tried to mimic that confidence. Even as their bodies ached from endless drills, Elias kept his mouth shut and his head down. He learned quickly that the loudest voices attracted the harshest attention, and in a place like this that was rarely a good thing. So he became skilled at moving in the background, completing his tasks without complaint, blending into the blur of identical faces under the same gray fatigues. His peers saw him as the quiet one, and not in the way that inspired curiosity. There was no mystery to him, at least not in their eyes. He was simply the cadet who always followed orders, never argued, and never stood out during physical evaluations. He scored just above average, enough to avoid punishment, but not enough to earn praise. During marksmanship tests, his aim was steady but unremarkable. In team exercises, he obeyed commands but never volunteered to lead. All of it combined into an image of someone destined to graduate into a desk position if he graduated at ULA. Was aware of how others perceived him, and though it stung, he accepted it as a temporary truth. He had come here not to impress them but to learn, and he knew that real growth happened in silence. He spent his nights in the dim light of the barracks, studying field manuals on wildlife behavior, terrain navigation, and predator psychology, subjects most cadets skimmed over because they seemed irrelevant to urban combat scenarios. But Elias believed that understanding the patterns of living things was as crucial as knowing how to fire a weapon. He absorbed every scrap of information, memorizing details about how predators hunted, stalked, and communicated with one another. What Elias could not have known was that these quiet, solitary hours would become the foundation of something no one at the academy could have predicted. For the world beyond the training grounds was far wilder and far more dangerous than most cadets were prepared for, and there would come a moment when all the drills and weapons in the world would mean nothing compared to the knowledge stored in the mind of a boy everyone thought was just a rookie. When the orders came down that the cadet class would be deployed to the uncharted reserve for survival training, the announcement was met with a mix of excitement and dread. Among the recruits, the reserve had a reputation spoken of in fragments and rumors. It was said to be a place where the most dangerous predators on the continent roamed freely, a patch of untamed wilderness so perilous that even seasoned rangers avoided it. Unless absolutely necessary for many cadets, it was an opportunity to prove themselves in the harshest conditions imaginable. For others, it was a looming test that could expose their weaknesses. Elias listened quietly during the briefing, his face unreadable as the instructors outlined the objectives, which sounded simple enough on paper: set up camp, navigate the terrain, observe and record wildlife behavior, and above all, off. The transport ride to the reserve was long and silent, the cadets sitting shoulder to shoulder in the metal confines of the vehicle, the hum of the engine blending with the occasional clink of gear. Elias sat near the back, staring at the shifting patterns of shadow and light cast by the canopy overhead as the transport rumbled deeper into the forest. The air grew thicker, and the scent of damp earth and foliage seeped into every breath. When they finally arrived, the world outside the transport looked like something out of another age. Towering trees with trunks as wide as vehicles stretched skyward, their branches woven into a dense green ceiling. Shafts of sunlight pierced through in scattered beams, illuminating swirls of dust and pollen. The ground was uneven, carpeted with moss and littered with gnarled roots. A Squad was divided into smaller teams, each given a sector to monitor. Elias was assigned to the perimeter observation unit, along with 3 other cadets. His role was clear watch for wildlife activity, record movement patterns, and report any potential threats. It was considered the least glamorous assignment, far from the central camp and the more hands-on survival drills the others were tasked with. There were no glory points to be earned in simply watching from a distance, which suited Elias fine. The rest of his unit seemed to think of it as a boring chore, complaining under their breath as they trudged toward their designated post. Elias, however, took in every detail, scanning the undergrowth for signs of animal trails, listening to the faint rustle of leaves that hinted at movement. First day passed uneventfully, though. The forest never seemed truly still. Birds, with bright plumage, flitted from branch to branch, their calls sharp and varied. Insects droned in constant rhythms, and somewhere far off, something heavy moved with deliberate steps that made the ground faintly tremble. When night fell, the forest transformed. The sounds became deeper and slower, the darkness swallowing shapes and turning every shadow into a possible threat. The other cadets in Elias' unit grew restless, their chatter fading as unease took root. Elias, on the other hand, felt a strange calm, as if he had been preparing for this environment his whole life. He knew the predators were out there somewhere, watching unseen, and he also knew from the way the forest felt that they would not remain hidden for long. By the second day in the reserve, the routine had settled into a steady rhythm. The cadets rotated shifts, keeping watch on the perimeter while others ran small scouting routes to map trails and water sources. Elias kept his focus sharp, noting every sign that the forest was more alive than it appeared. Broken twigs, fresh prints in the mud, claw marks etched high into tree bark, and occasional drops of something dark that could have been sap or could have been blood. The other cadets in his unit took these details lightly, dismissing them as the background noise of nature, but Elias recognized them as signals, threads in a larger pattern that was slowly weaving itself into a picture he did not yet fully understand. It was near dusk when the forest changed in a way that was impossible to ignore. The sounds that had been constant since their arrival faded. The birds went silent, the insects stilled, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The other cadets noticed it. To one of them muttered a nervous joke, but his voice cracked and no one laughed. Elias felt the skin along his arms tighten with the electric charge of instinct. He scanned the tree line. The shadows between the trunks seemed thicker now, and shapes shifted just beyond the reach of his vision. A faint growl rolled through the air, low and drawn out like the rumble of distant thunder. It was followed by another from a different direction, then another, until they surrounded the unit. The others gripped their rifles, eyes darting in every direction, their movements jerky and uncertain. Elias stayed perfectly still, his breathing slow. He could almost sense the positions of the predators, even without seeing them. A triangulation of danger closing in step by deliberate step. The first flash of movement came from the left, a massive shape slipping through the foliage so smoothly it barely disturbed the leaves. Its outline suggested muscle and speed, a predator built for the kill. Then another appeared on the opposite side, and another behind them. The cadets were being herded, driven inward toward the narrow clearing where their observation post stood. The unit leader barked in order to hold position, but his voice carried more fear than command. The tension in the air tightened like a rope pulled taut. Elias knew from his studies that apex predators in coordinated packs rarely rushed their prey. They preferred to pressure it, to exhaust it, to make it panic before the strike. One of the cadets broke and fired a shot into the trees. The sound cracked through the forest, and the shapes melted back into the shadows for a moment, but Elias could tell they had not retreated. They were simply circling, recalculating the hunt. The forest was utterly still again, except for the soft, measured sound of something heavy pacing just beyond the line of sight. Elias felt every eye in his unit flick toward him without understanding why they were looking at him and not the tree line. And though he had no rank, no authority, he realized in that moment that they were waiting for him to do something. The forest seemed to lean closer, as if it too was watching what would happen next. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and something sharper, a metallic tenth that Elias recognized from the field manuals as the smell of predator breath, carried on the wind. The growls came again, deeper now, vibrating through the ground beneath their boots, and the shapes in the shadows began to move with more purpose. The cadets tightened their grip on their rifles, their breaths coming in quick, shallow bursts. The leader tried to give an order, but his voice faltered, and whatever authority he had left dissolved into the humid air. Elias stepped forward without thinking, his eyes locked on the darkest gap between two massive trunks, where he could see a faint glint of eyes reflecting the fading light. He raised a hand not to signal an attack but to hold his unit in place. The others hesitated, unsure if they should obey him, but something in his calm, steady posture rooted them to the spot. Elias had read enough about predator behavior to know that sudden panic movements would only trigger a charge, and he could sense from their formation that this was not a random encounter. This was a coordinated test of dominance. The predators were measuring them the way a hunter sizes up its prey. The worst thing they could do was act like Protha. First predator stepped into view, and the breath caught in the throats of every cadet who saw it. It was larger than any of them had imagined, its shoulders rolling with controlled power, each step silent despite its massive frame. Its coat was a mottled blend of black and deep bronze, perfectly suited for the shadows. Its head was low, its eyes locked on Elias, and behind it, in the shadows, more pairs of eyes glimmered like scattered embers in the dark. It did not rush. Instead, it paced from side to side, slow, deliberate, showing them the size of its territory. The message was clear. "You are in my world." One of the younger cadets muttered that they should fire. Elias did not look back, but his voice came low and certain, telling them to hold. Elias took one slow step forward, closing the distance by a single pace. His hands empty to show no immediate threat, but his posture radiated a confidence he did not entirely feel. He knew from his studies that predators respected displays of fearlessness more than anything else, and he was gambling that his read on this pack was correct. The lead predator stopped its pacing, its eyes narrowing as if reassessing the human standing before it. The seconds stretched into an eternity, the forest holding its breath, the rest of the pack shifting uneasily behind the leader. Then, without warning, the lead predator let out a short, sharp huff, a signal Elias recognized from his late-night studies as a withdrawal command. It turned, melting back into the shadows, and the others followed their glowing eyes, disappearing one by one into the dark, until the forest was empty again. The cadets stood frozen, unsure if they had been spared by chance or by something Elias had done, and Elias himself was not entirely sure, but he knew this was only the beginning. The night that followed was restless for the entire squad. Even though the predators had melted back into the darkness, their presence lingered, like a shadow over every thought. The cadets took turns on watch, but each shift ended with eyes straining into the blackness, ears catching faint sounds that may or may not have been real. Elias sat alone during his watch, the moon casting a pale light that painted the jungle in silver and black. The stillness was deceptive. He could feel the forest breathing, slowly, steadily, and beneath that he sensed movement far away, but drawing closer he was certain the predators had not left. They had simply been testing them before deciding how to strike. When dawn came, the relief was short-lived. The mist that curled between the trees seemed heavier than before, muffling sound and distorting shapes. The squad moved, carefully gathering their gear for the day's assignments, but Elias noticed fresh signs in the dirt near their perimeter, large prints deep in the soil, the edges sharp and clean, meaning they had been made only hours ago. He followed the trail a few steps, noting how the tracks circled the camp before vanishing into the undergrowth. Whoever or whatever had made them had been close enough to watch every movement of the squad. As they slept by midday, the unease had grown into something sharper. The birds remained silent, the air thick with the scent of wet fur and the faint metallic temps of blood. Elias felt it in his bones. The predators were closing in again, and this time they would not stop at intimidation. The first sound was a distant roar rolling through the trees like a wave of thunder. The second was closer, sharper, followed by the crack of branches. As something heavy moved through the undergrowth, the cadets froze, weapons raised, their formation tight, but their eyes wide with fear. Elias stepped into the open, scanning the shadows, his mind racing through every behavioral pattern he had studied. The first figure appeared, to his right, larger than the leader from the night before, its coat streaked with fresh mud, its eyes bright with hunger. Then another emerged from the opposite side, and another, until the clearing was ringed with moving shapes. Some crouched low, others pacing, their muscles coiled for the charge. Elias knew there would be no warning. They would attack as one, and the only chance the squad had was to break the momentum before it began. He moved forward again, his steps slow but certain, raising his arms slightly, not in surrender but in a gesture meant to draw all attention to himself. The predators shifted their focus toward him, and the air between them felt like it might ignite from the tension. He began to speak, not loudly but with a steady rhythm, his voice carrying words the cadets did not recognize, a mixture of sounds he had learned from countless hours studying predator calls. The lead hunter tilted its head, the movement small but significant. Then it stepped back a single pace and let out a short bark. The others froze, their bodies still tense, but their forward drive halted for reasons only. They seemed to understand. The standoff stretched. As the squad waited, their breaths shallow, the predators stood at the edge of the clearing, watching Elias with an expression that almost resembled recognition, and then, without a sound, they began to fade back into the jungle, leaving the cadets alive but shaken, and leaving Elias with a question he could not yet answer. Why did they listen to him at all? Word of what had happened in the reserve spread through the academy faster than Elias could have imagined. By the time the squad returned from their assignment, the story had already grown beyond the truth. Some claimed he had stared down a charging beast until it turned away. Others whispered that he had some hidden technology or secret weapon that scared them off. Elias ignored the rumors. He had no desire to correct or encourage them, but he could not ignore the way people looked at him now. Instructors who had once walked past without a glance now studied him, as if trying to understand what had changed. His fellow cadets kept their distance, some out of respect, others out of quiet fear, as if they thought standing too close to him might draw the predators back. During the debriefing, the squad leader struggled to explain what had happened. His report was full of uncertainty and vague descriptions about the predators' behavior. When questioned directly about Elias, the leader hesitated, then admitted that he had seen something unusual, though he could not say exactly what. The commanding officer dismissed it as stress under extreme conditions, but Elias noticed the way his eyes lingered a fraction longer on him before moving on. Life at the academy did not return to normal. The next set of field exercises was scheduled for a different location far from the reserve, yet Elias could feel the same heavy gaze of the jungle, even in the open training fields. He caught himself scanning the horizon for movement, listening for sounds that did not belong. One night during a late watch, he thought he saw a pair of glowing eyes at the far edge of the perimeter, too far to be sure but close enough to stir the feeling that the predators had not forgotten him. The instructors began assigning him to more observation missions, tasks meant for experienced cadets rather than rookies. His role was always the same: to watch and report. Yet it became clear they were testing him, watching to see if the strange events would repeat. Sometimes he was sent with other squads, sometimes alone. In each case nothing attacked, though there were always signs, tracks in the mud, claw marks on trees, scat still warm in the undergrowth, as if something had been there moments before, and then vanished before being seen. Elias kept quiet about the details. He noticed the way the forests seemed to move differently when he was present, the way animals avoided certain paths, and how the usual warning calls of birds and small creatures would return sooner when he was near, as if his presence made the world less tense. He could not explain it, and he did not try. What he did know was that the line between hunter and hunted felt thinner now than it ever had before, and he was no longer certain which side of it he stood on. The academy grounds had always been considered untouchable, the walls high, the watchtowers armed, and the surrounding land cleared for hundreds of meters to prevent any creature from approaching without being seen. Yet on the third night of the new training cycle, the alarms sounded not for a drill but for a breach. The floodlights swept across the open field beyond the gates, revealing movement at the tree line, dozens of glowing eyes reflecting the artificial light, the shapes shifting slowly closer, not in a charge but in a deliberate march that sent a ripple of unease through every cadet on watch. The instructors scrambled into position, issuing orders while the automated defenses locked onto the advancing forms, but no one fired, because the predators stopped just beyond the range of the perimeter. Elias was in the barracks when the call came for all cadets to assemble. He stepped outside into the cold night air, and felt it instantly, the same weight, the same electric charge that had filled the reserve, the air thick with the scent of fur and musk. The predators stood still, their silhouettes massive under the floodlights, the largest among them a figure Elias recognized even at this distance, the leader from the first encounter, its head held high, eyes fixed on him, as if no one else existed. The instructors tried to push Elias back toward the safety of the inner compound, but the leader let out a single sharp call, and the rest of the pack responded with low rolling growls that froze everyone in place. The cadets clutched their rifles, waiting for the order to fire, but it never came. The commanding officer instead called for silence. The tension was unbearable, the air vibrating with the soundless exchange between the predators and the lone cadet standing at the edge of the formation. Elias felt his heart pounding, but his steps were steady as he walked toward the front line. He could hear the protests of his fellow cadets behind him, but they sounded far away. The only thing that felt real was the gaze of the predator leader and the stillness of the pack behind it. When he stopped a few paces ahead of the others, the leader tilted its head slightly, the movement slow, deliberate, the kind of gesture meant to be read not as aggression but as recognition. Elias raised his hand, palm outward, a signal of stillness, not only to the humans behind him but to the beasts. Before him, for several long moments, nothing happened. The world seemed suspended in that fragile balance. Then the leader let out another short call, softer this time, and turned away. The pack followed, melting into the darkness without haste, without fear, leaving only the echo of their presence hanging in the cold air. The cadets exhaled. All at once, the sound, almost as loud as the alarms that had first drawn them here, and though no one spoke, the unspoken truth settled heavily over them. The predators had come here for him, and for some reason they had left because of him. The events of that night left the academy in a state of quiet turmoil. No one admitted it aloud, but the breach had shaken. The unshakable, the walls had held, the defenses had not been tested yet. The predators had approached without fear, and withdrawn, without violence, and that was somehow more unsettling than an outright attack. The commanders met behind closed doors for hours. The cadets speculated in hushed voices, some claiming the creatures were testing the academy, others convinced that they were warning of something worse. Elias stayed silent through it all. He knew. The eyes of both his peers and his superiors were on him now. More than ever, the decision came at dawn. Elias was called into the strategy hall where the senior officers sat in a semicircle, their faces hard and unreadable. They told him plainly that his connection to the predators could no longer be ignored. It was not a reprimand but a mission. He was to return to the reserve, accompanied by a small team with orders to observe, track, and if possible understand why the apex predators responded to him in a way they did to no one else. Elias listened without reaction, but inside he felt the slow churn of unease. He had faced those creatures twice and survived, but going back voluntarily into their territory, knowing they might be waiting for him, felt like stepping into a story whose ending he could not predict. His team was assembled quickly, two veteran scouts, an armed escort of 4, and a biologist whose specialty was predator behavior. The equipment was top of the line: drones for aerial monitoring, sensors to detect movement at a distance, tranquilizers in case of emergency. Yet Elias could not shake the feeling that all of it was useless. If the predators decided to act, the journey back to the reserve was long and silent, the vehicle rattling over rough ground until the trees closed in again, and the air grew heavy with the same thick scent he remembered from before. When they reached the perimeter of the reserve, the scouts set up camp in a narrow clearing near a shallow stream. The biologist began placing sensors while the armed escort kept watch. Elias moved a short distance away, scanning the tree line. The forest was alive with sound, but underneath it he sensed the same subtle rhythm as before, a pulse in the air that was almost like breathing. By the second night, the sensors began picking up movement, large shapes moving in slow, deliberate arcs around the camp, never closer than 100 meters but never leaving entirely. The armed escort grew tense, the biologist fascinated, scribbling notes by the light of a dim lantern. Elias felt it before he saw them, the quiet shift in the forest, the drop in bird calls, the way the air cooled against his skin. He stepped toward the edge of the clearing, and there, in the shadow between two massive trunks, the predator leader emerged once again, its eyes fixed on him, not hostile, not afraid, simply watching. And behind it, shapes moved in the darkness, a gathering not of hunters preparing to strike, but of something else entirely, something Elias did not yet understand. The camp was silent as Elias stood at the edge of the clearing, the dim lantern light behind him casting long shadows into the forest. The predator leader stepped forward, its massive frame moving with a slow, deliberate grace, its eyes locked on his, as if measuring something beyond his stance or scent. Behind it, more figures appeared, one by one, slipping from the shadows, until the tree line shimmered with the faint glow of dozens of eyes. The armed escort tensed, weapons ready, but Elias raised a hand without looking back, a silent command for them to hold. The predators made no move to attack. Instead, they formed a loose semicircle, their bodies, low heads tilted in a posture that spoke of neither submission nor challenge. Elias took a step forward, his boots sinking into the soft earth, the air thick with the scent of fur and damp leaves. He could hear the steady breathing of the creatures around him. and somewhere beneath that, a faint low hum, like the resonance of the earth itself. He stopped within a few paces of the leader, and for a moment they simply regarded each other. The biologist whispered from behind that this was unprecedented. No known predator species acted like this. Elias barely heard her, his focus entirely on the creature before him. The leader leaned its head closer, its eyes reflecting the faint light in a way that made them seem almost human. Elias felt something stir in the back of his mind, a connection raw and wordless, as if the creature was not just looking at him but into him. He remembered his late nights in the barracks, studying every scrap of knowledge he could find about predator communication and behavior, yet this was something no manual had prepared him for. He understood without knowing how that they were not here to hunt him, they were here to acknowledge him. The leader stepped back and let out a single deep call, the sound rolling through the forest and into the bones of everyone who heard it. The other predators echoed it in lower tones, a chorus that filled the air, and then, as one, they turned and vanished into the trees, leaving the clearing empty except for the lingering echo of their voices. Elias stood still, long after they had gone, the forest slowly returning to its usual sounds. The biologist moved to his side, asking what had just happened, but Elias had no answer. He only knew that whatever this was, it had been a choice on their part. When the team returned to the academy, the report was vague. There was no video footage clear enough to prove what had occurred, no physical evidence that could explain why the predators had gathered or why they had left without violence. Yet the story spread through the academy and beyond. The rookie cadet who had walked into the heart of the wild and stood before the fiercest predators alive without flinching, and who, for reasons no one could fully understand, had been spared. And from that day the name Elias carried a weight that no rank could measure, a quiet legend born, not from victory in battle but from the moment when even apex predators chose to walk away.